mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. We bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show. It's your host, Katie Burke. Today, I have a special guest on the show. It is Doug Lodermeier from Minnesota. He is a call and decoy collector, historian, all things waterfowling, basically. Specializing in Minnesota, or do you branch out from Minnesota?
I really, over the years, I have definitely concentrated on Minnesota, and that's my area of interest.
Well, welcome to the show, Doug.
Well, nice to be on the show, and nice to see you again.
Yeah. I guess we got to see each other last in Chicago, which, if people listen to this show, they know a little bit about the North American Decoy Collector Show. I interviewed Rick last year.
Nice.
So.
Yeah.
I think that's the last time we got to see each other, but you're in town, which I'm really excited about, a new exhibit coming in of your calls and a little bit extra, not just calls, but a little bit more.
Well, you know, most of the call makers, or a lot of the call makers, dabbled in other things as well, including decoy making and that sort of thing. So for some of the calls that cross-pollinated like that, the call makers that cross-pollinated, I brought in some decoys and some other examples of some of their work.
So I know, some call makers across have a little more than just calls, but does Minnesota in general lead to more like call makers and decoy call? Like, do they kind of have more jack trades in Minnesota, or is that?
I think that's fair to say. I would say that they did a lot of both of them.
Okay.
And you think about the type of people that were doing that, and you had a lot of hard-headed Norwegians and Swedes and all that sort of thing,
right.
and they really felt like they could make something themselves just as good as something that could be store-bought. And back in those times too, the earlier we go, time was something they had more than they had money.
Okay.
So they all were entrepreneurial in that respect.
Okay, yeah, because like in Arkansas, Tennessee, you seem to find like just a call maker.
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
So in there, you kind of like,
we have multiple examples of people that did that. Maybe made decoys, maybe made calls, maybe made spearing decoys as well.
Oh, right. Yeah. Forget about that.
Or were artists or something else as well. So there was a lot of cross pollination.
We have not talked about spearing decoys on here, obviously because we're ducks, but that's a whole
a whole nother world entirely.
Yes, so we may not get into that. So every time I have someone new on the show, I really like to go back a little before and talk about your introduction into hunting and waterfowling in general. So how did you get into hunting, and what kind of sparked that joy and love to stay in part of it?
So I have a really interesting path into that world. So I hope we have a lot of time here.
Oh,
but
all the time.
I'm going to ramble on a little bit about that because it's sort of interesting. So I was born in a little town. I was born in Little Falls, Minnesota, which was a small town in north central Minnesota. I didn't live there very long. My father was a printer by trade, so we moved around quite a bit. So from there, he moved down to Malacca, Minnesota, then St. Paul, and then eventually settled in Minneapolis. So I grew up as an inner city Minneapolis kid. Fortunately, Minneapolis is a nice city because we have great park system and lots of lakes and that sort of thing. But I always had a love of the outdoors, and I always enjoyed being outside more than I enjoyed being inside. And I spent a lot of time going down to city lakes and fishing. And on my drive down here with my friend, but we were talking about it, I said, a guy could walk down. I'm talking about probably, in the 1960s. I could walk from my house a mile down to the chain of lakes in Minneapolis, and I could pick up bait on the way. I would pick up leopard frogs. I would pick up hoppers, and once in a while, if I was lucky, I'd look in a window well and I'd find a salamander, and we would go down and we would fish with that. So I was an urban fisherman. I was fascinated with firearms. My dad was in World War II. He was all over in Africa, Europe, and in the service and saw action. He came home from the war, and his position was he didn't care if he ever picked up a gun again. Fortunately, he understood my desire to want to handle firearms and learn to shoot and so on. So he got me involved in the right organizations. He got me involved with camps, which goes back to Boys Club of America, which had a camp. And so we had a club in the city, and they had a camp that was up at Willow River, Minnesota. At that camp, they had firearms instructions, and we got to shoot firearms, and we got to shoot bow and arrows, and learn archery and camping and cooking and outdoors, all things outdoor. Fabulous opportunity for a kid like me. And that's really where I cut my teeth doing this. And I'm talking about 9 years old type of stuff, 10 years old. So we had a great opportunity to do that and learn boating skills, canoeing, all those types of things. So that was really my entree and my introduction into some of those sports. From there, it was a matter of finding somebody that would take me hunting. So that was the next thing for me. So I mean, I dabbled a little bit with it with my grandparents who had farms up in north central Minnesota, up by Lastra, Piers, in that area. But it was crow hunting and a little bit of varmint and some odds and ends like that, but not what I wanted to do, which would be upland bird hunting, duck hunting, goose hunting, that sort of thing. So I guess from there, I started looking for people that did those types of things. And I was fortunate in my teens to run into a friend by the name of Bill Brooks from Minneapolis, who was very much into that sort of thing too. His father also didn't hunt, but he had friends. His father introduced him to some friends of his that did. So we started glomming onto these people to take us hunting. This pre having vehicles or anything like that. So we would start getting involved with them. One of the neighborhood guys was a man by the name of Dan Brennan. Dan Brennan was a accomplished outdoor writer. He wrote for all the big three magazines of the time. He wrote some stuff that was critically acclaimed. One of our bombers is missing on his World War II experiences. He was a big-time hunter, and he didn't mind taking us under his wings. Of course, we got all the dirt work, right?
Right, yeah, so ask.
But we had to learn. That was our apprenticeship. And there was other people like this that were instrumental in letting us go with them and come with them and learn our trade, if you will. Other people was friends from school that fathers were hunters and had, fortunately for us, some property that, some very exceptional properties that we could hunt up in northern Minnesota. And again, this is mid-northern Minnesota, so I'm talking the area like the Hinckley area.
Right. I mean, the landscape in that area, you're lucky in that you were not that far from.
No, you don't have to. You did not have to leave Minneapolis very far to be in the either farm country or north country.
Right.
As simple as that. If I went south, I was in pheasants. If I went north, I was in grouse. We were fortunate to have another mentor who owned property in the Hinckley area, which is on the eastern side of Minnesota, right by the St. Croix River, separates Wisconsin and Minnesota. Not exactly the best of waterfowling areas, but phenomenal grouse, phenomenal woodcock hunting, deer, all that sort of thing. But the waterfowling back then, we're talking about 70s, 80s, 90s, was still, quite good.
Yeah.
And the properties they had rivers, backwater sloughs, potholes, and he had a lake dredged on this property. And this is an exclusive, 1,500 acre property that we had. So it was really a great place for us to hunt.
Yeah.
And we could hunt whatever we wanted to. We could hunt divers on the lake. We could hunt mallards in the potholes. We could go in the backwaters and we would be hunting, wood duck and teal. So it was a great opportunity opportunity for us. From there, we eventually got our licenses, and then we really started embarking. Then we opened up a whole new world to us.
Right.
But that's kind of how I got into hunting, basically.
Do you still hunt with that friend?
Unfortunately, he's probably one of the people that we talk about has grayed out. I don't know if he's grayed out as much as his physical limitations have caused him more grief than being grayed out. So we haven't hunted it as we did, but boy, we sure hunted for a lot of decades together.
So from there, when does the history of waterfowling become an interest?
So that leads into a whole nother thing, the collecting thing. And I've always said either you have the collecting gene or you don't have the collecting gene.
Oh, I 100% agree with that. That's like
you can't make somebody be a collector if
No.
they're not interested in something like that. And I don't know where I think you're just born with it, I swear. So for me, the normal path was, I started collecting probably marbles first, then baseball and sporting cards, and then coins, and it got a little bit more serious. And my father was a coin collector. My father was a collector of things, so I got the gene from him for sure. But then my interest in fishing and outdoors and waterfowling and hunting and stuff led me to want to start collecting artifacts. It seemed like a natural progression, and it seemed like
what was your first thing?
So the first thing is an interesting story.
I always like the story.
I think I was about 18 years old. I know I was 18 years old because the drinking age had just changed in Minnesota, and I was sitting at a bar. So I'm sitting at a bar, and across the bar from me is a guy complaining loudly about his father who had just passed away, and all he left him was a bunch of old wooden fishing plugs of all things. Yeah. And I'm listening to him for the longest time across the bar, and I'm listening to him complain. And the more he complains, I finally said, how many plugs did he leave you? And he goes, probably 50. So we're talking in the early 70s, and I said, this was a princely sum to me. I said, I'll give you $50 sight unseen for him. All right. So we got up. He ran out, came back with 50 old wooden plugs, and I became a lure collector. That started me lure collecting. So I was a lure collector first, which made sense with my interest in fishing and so on.
Right. Yeah.
After a while, I guess I kind of lost interest in it. I liked it. I still enjoyed it, but I kind of lost the interest in it. I was looking for something new to do. And it struck me, with hunting, that decoys would be a logical progression for me. And that actually started by going on an antique foray with my soon-to-be wife and a friend, and I went along, and I really was an antiquer at that time. So I'm walking around, and the first thing I saw that interested me was an old papier-mâché carry light decoy, which I carried out of that store. Yeah. And I spent, again, $20 for that, if that. So that was my first decoy I ever collected. But that started me collecting decoys and making me start looking and learning more about decoys. So when I started collecting decoys, I collected decoys from everywhere. And this is something that most collectors do. They have no vision. They have no shape to their collection. They just start amassing things.
Right. That's very common.
And I'm not any different than anybody else. So I was collecting whatever I liked, whatever interests me. And I realized I started having a collection that made no sense whatsoever.
Right.
It was fun, but it didn't make any sense. Over time, I thought I'd start specializing. So I started looking at, I thought factory decoys would be a good way to go. So I started looking at
that makes sense where you are.
Yeah, and I started looking at factory decoys. And Masons, of course, caught my eye, but Masons were already pretty well known about. So I started thinking, and they were starting to actually get spendy by the time I was starting to collect. So I did some research and I looked around and I liked Evans decoys, and they were made in Ladysmith, Wisconsin. They were kind of a neighbor and close in my region, and so I started collecting Evans decoys. Well, I did that for a while.
And I didn't know that actually.
Yeah, and then, but I still was collecting stuff from other places as well. Yeah. Eventually, and I realized I had missed the heyday or the entry place into collecting decoys. It was already starting to cost pretty serious money to put good birds on your shelf.
Right.
It wasn't a secret anymore, and there was already auction houses, and there was all this stuff was going on.
So when was this?
I'm going to have to say I'm guessing we're talking in probably the 90s or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, early 2000s, something.
Okay, like late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, probably early 90s, closer to early 90s. So I started thinking again. I go, what else is there? What other opportunities are there? And then it occurred to me. I go, duck calls. Yeah. There's a nice trapping for a hunter and something that's interesting. Right. Maybe I'll start looking into duck calls because that had not really exploded yet at this time.
And at that point, like we can say, like, is Howard's book out yet?
It is, and that was his and Brian McGrath's books.
Illinois book.
His was another general book. He actually, I believe, beat Howard to the punch, but Howard's book was pretty much considered the Bible.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
It was, yeah. and I ordered that, and I started doing my research. So I'm doing the research. At first, I'm overwhelmed. I'm going, oh, this is too much. There's too much stuff out here. And what do you collect, and how do you collect? And,
right.
But then I started liking different things. I like this. I like Purdue. I like Chick Majors. I like,
Right.
So I'm seeing stuff that I like. I'm also going, I can't believe how much stuff there is out here. Right. So I started having to learn and educate myself a little bit more as that goes on. Got Brian McGrath's book, educated myself with that. Again, Howard's book, and then I started looking for calls, and I started looking for calls in the usual places, decoy shows. We have a great show up in Minnesota. Mm-hmm. I was on the board of directors for both the Minnesota Decoys Collectors Association and the Minnesota Decoy Foundation, which charter was to preserve the history of waterfowling in Minnesota.
Okay.
Shows was a typical venue, flea markets, maybe estate sales,
right.
Antique stores, that sort of thing. So I started, browsing and cruising around looking for calls. And again, you're picking up calls. They migrate,
Yes, right.
So I'm getting a Louisiana call. I'm getting a, Illinois call. I'm getting something from California. I'm getting something from Minnesota.
So at that time, was there the Call Collectors Association?
Yes.
That existed then?
So then I found them. And then
Okay.
that was another Kindred Spirits. And they had a newsletter. And that was more education.
Do you know when that started? I can't
tell you, but I think we're talking the 80s, 87.
Okay, it wasn't very many people, though.
No, there wasn't. No. I got in the fairly early years
right.
of that.
And I guess for our audience to know that there's decoy collecting, but call collecting is like a subculture from that. It's a more niche. It's not nearly as big.
I remember when the call collectors were less appreciated at the shows, but now we've learned to commingle very nicely together.
You do, and I always find it funny at auctions. The room will switch out, and when the calls come up, like all the decoy people will go. It's going less so, but it's still like the whole room will shift in a auction. And I'll
notice when I go to view some of the better collections that I've had the opportunity to view that even the hardcore decoy collectors have a few calls on their shelves as well.
They do. And I found more. Honestly, I found more people have calls that they got by getting decoys that people don't realize they have.
Right. Yes.
Like early in their collecting, because they just kind of came
And
together.
If you think of it makes sense. If you have a Purdue decoys and that's your thing, how could you not have a Purdue call to show with that? I mean,
exactly.
it makes sense. So you see some of that. They might not be hardcore collectors, but they collect some things.
Right.
So I wound up collecting calls from all over, and I had started getting a pretty large collection together, but it was real scattergun approach again. So I wasn't. It had no. There was no vision or plan to it. I also realized I could not compete with. I'm a working guy. I wasn't going to compete with the guys that I was trying to compete with, whether it was on eBay, and I got in pretty much on the infancy of eBay. That was a great way to get more calls than going through antique stores and flea markets, and it opened up a broader spectrum. But I couldn't compete with the guys that had deeper pockets than me, and I realized I'm never going to put together the type of collection I would like to put together.
Right.
So eventually, I sold off my whole collection.
the whole thing.
The whole thing. And I did the same thing with my decoys. All the decoys I had at this point, and I've sold it off with the sole intention of focusing on Minnesota decoys and calls. That was my plan.
So you got this money, you got all this cash.
Yes.
You're ready to go.
Yeah. Kind of.
Well, how did your wife feel about this move?
She tolerates my foolishness. She has no idea what I'm doing, and she really doesn't care, but she understands.
It's like me and fantasy baseball.
Yeah, there you go. So she understands, and she's a good trooper. I'll say that about her. But she understands my passion, just like dogs and hunting and everything else I do. She goes.
Well, I bet she's in it on for the dogs. She probably likes the dogs.
Well, she used to like to say when I told her I'm going hunting, she says, I don't care, just take the boys with you. I said that was the plan. And I was, just take the dogs with you. I said that's the plan. So that works out pretty good. But I did. So that's what I did. I kind of thought about it. And I'm really interested in the history of Minnesota, and there's a lot of people don't realize how much waterfowling history is in Minnesota.
Right.
We don't. Excuse me. We don't lead the nation anymore. We're not as important of a waterfowling state as we once were. But there was a time not very long that I grew up in. We led the nation per capita on hunters. We sold more licenses. We shot more waterfowl. It was pretty tremendous.
Yes, I'd say Minnesota and Wisconsin were the leaders there for a good long time.
But young guys growing up now don't recognize the importance of Minnesota, and they don't know the history going back and how much of a waterfowling destination this was, and that people, captains of industry from the east would come to Minnesota to hunt. That was the place. Heron Lake, Lake Christina, Marsh Lake, all these places. That was the epicenter of duck hunting in those days.
Yeah, I don't even know if you know the story, but like the rebirth of the Canada goose is from Minnesota.
Of course, I'm very familiar with that. Rochester, Minnesota.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a whole nother.
That's another story.
That's a whole other story we won't get into, but
the history and going back to market hunting and all of that is very important. History comes from Minnesota, and you start looking at the important people from the standpoint of James Ford Bell and what he did and what he meant to waterfowling, and the Heron Lake decoys moving to the Delta Marsh and the Ducharmes and the connection between Canadian decoys and Minnesota decoys. I could go on the artists that have come from here. The waterfowling history, we have probably the most. Yeah, it's probably the richest history in that too. So waterfowling has always been a very important part of Minnesota, and I've always been interested in it. So that's why I decided, why aren't I not collecting Minnesota stuff? That's what I started focusing on doing, and that's what I did. Now, a decoy or a call, it's great. At first, you're just trying to amass things and find these pieces, right?
Right.
But eventually, it's just an artifact. If you don't have the backstory and you don't have the history, what does it really mean? And that I've always been interested in history and consider myself something of a historian and inquisitive by nature. And I started doing research on it. I've got more and more interested. And the more I learned about one call maker, for instance, or a decoy maker, the more interesting it got. Now the piece came to life. There was a story in a history to the call. It wasn't just a piece of wood, inanimate wood. At the Minnesota Decoy Show, I met a gentleman who was one of our better call makers, one of the best call makers in Minnesota, and probably was the mentor to more young guys that are making calls in Minnesota. And we have a lot of good contemporary call makers in Minnesota. His name was Paul England. We called him Dr. Quack. He's a fellow Hall of Famer in Minnesota Waterfowl Hall of Fame. He's a call maker. He was a historian, always interested in the history of calls.
And he was willing to teach.
Well, yeah. Well,
not all call makers are.
No,
that's unusual.
I would say yes. He wasn't. His stuff wasn't proprietary. He was ready to share it with anybody that was interested in it. Greatest guy in the world. He recently passed away. We just lost Paul. But I don't think there's anyone in the call community who doesn't know who Paul England was. And he was very early with the Call Makers and Collectors Association of America, and he was writing a lot of articles on Minnesota call makers for the newsletter. So he was really pumping up Minnesota and was, he was a homer for them.
Right. Good.
But at the Decoy show, I would visit with him, and I was always drawn to him, and that was the one place I really wanted to go, to hit the corner where Paul was holding court. And he had a large cases of old Minnesota calls that he had collected. And I was always just fascinated by them. And I spent so much time looking at them and picking his brain and talking to him. And that's where I really got the bug for Minnesota calls, by looking at his calls. I would look at his collection, and I would think, wow, there's really a lot of stuff. We have a lot of history right here, and it's largely unknown. Eventually, I got the idea. So I'm starting to research these call makers. I'm getting a file cabinet full of information and a morgue filled of pictures and letters and correspondence, everything I can find, and information, obituaries, you name it, on different call makers. And it occurred to me it doesn't do me any good to have this in a file cabinet and just the information for myself. And I approached Paul one day at the Decoy show, and I said, what do you think of the idea of doing a book on Minnesota call makers? And I was inspired because Bob Christensen, did his book on Illinois. And that was the first book that I knew of, and I think was specific to a state. And I go, you could do a book on Illinois makers. Why couldn't you do a book on Minnesota makers? Now, what I haven't talked about is my background is a graphic artist, designer, art director. I've had my own agencies. I've worked in the publishing business my whole life. I worked for Honeywell. I worked for Korn Ferry.
So it's a natural fit for you to go into that.
That was my primary duties there. So now I've got the passion. Now I've got the knowledge. Now I've got the skill set.
And the resources.
And so if I don't do this book, who's going to do the book?
Right.
So I broached the idea with Paul, and I thought he was the first person I mentioned it to, and I thought I'd gauge his enthusiasm. Well, of course, he lit up like Christmas. He grabbed me by the belt. I got people I want you to meet. He became my biggest cheerleader and my biggest conscience of doing that project.
Okay.
And of course, he had
a lot of research.
He had the goods. He had already been doing some of this stuff.
So did he share all that with you?
I remember he was the first. So when I did the first book I wrote for my L&M Press was Minnesota Duck Calls, Yesterday's and Today's Folk Artists. That was in 2003, I believe I published that. Okay. First collection I photographed and was Paul England's. So I was going to go over to his house and photograph his collection. He says, no, just take them. I said, just take them. And we knew each other, but we only knew each other, I would call it casually. We weren't going out to dinner or anything like that.
Yeah.
I knew him from the shows.
Right.
And he said, oh, just take them with me. You just take them and bring them back when you're done. I thought, wow, that's a lot. That's a leap of faith and trust.
Yeah.
And I said, well, how do you want me to take these? And he starts putting them into buckets and just putting them on top of each other. He says, they're just wood. You ain't going to hurt them. And to this day,
that hurts my museum brain.
It does, but I'll tell you, to this day, it's always flavored my thinking. And I was talking to another gentleman. He says, how did you pack all those calls to go down to Memphis?
Baby socks.
I used to do that. Yes. I would buy
little girl socks.
But I didn't even do that. I just put them in rows with a divider between them and another divider and stacked them in their 2 boxes. And I go, nothing's going to happen to them doing that.
No, I've never had anything happen. But,
I wouldn't ship them that way. But with me carrying them, I've done so many shows all over the country.
Oh, yeah.
You learn that you're not going to hurt them.
I digress, but one of the first times I ever heard about the little girl socks, and I can never stop picturing this. Howard Harlan is who told me about them. And he was like, yeah, you get some weird looks when you go up in Walmart and you buy like 15 packs of little girl socks.
And you know what? I thought I was the only guy that did that, but I walked into Target one day and I go, whoa. So a lot of guys had the same inspiration apparently.
It says you get some funny looks when you do that.
Oh, you do, yeah.
But anyway, we digress. But yeah, so
that's what got me started.
That's where you got started on the book.
Yeah, and that's what got me started on the books, and of course that really led into some really digging, and really exhaustive.
I have a lot of questions about that. So the first is the first is the decoy book. I didn't realize they were in the call book, and then it's the decoy book. What's the years between those first two books?
Okay, 2003, I believe, was the and I'm going by memory right now, but 2003, I think I published the Minnesota Duck Calls. I think it was 2010 that I got to the Minnesota Decoys.
I don't think I realized there was such a big difference. And now the volume 2s came out together.
And the volume 2s came out together because basically the idea of doing these books, I knew it would bring out more information out of the woodworks, and there would be more makers that would be discovered. And that's what happened. People got the books. People looked at the books. Oh, you know what? My dad made decoys. My father made calls, or there's another guy up in so and so up in Holly, Minnesota, that makes duck calls. So I started gathering new information and starting to build another couple file cabinets full of information, which I go, all right, now I've got enough. Originally, I was going to. I figured I'd have enough information to do a combined volume 2 of both the call and the decoy. When I got up to like 14, when I got up to about 1,400 pages, I go, I'm going to have to divide this into 2 books.
Those books are hefty.
They are, but they really are exhaustive, and they're really extensive, and they really do, they really are the essential history of both call making up to this date.
Yes,
and decoys.
The one thing I really enjoy about your books is the price guide. That's not something a lot of people do.
Nobody,
and it's
pretty much.
Nobody really. I mean, you can get them through auctions and things like that. Sometimes collections will be posted that way, like separately, but not that much with calls at all. But because they haven't been auctioned that much.
And that was I did that, establish that by auction sales, eBay sales. So I had literally 2 file cabinets, 6 drawers deep of eBay over 20-year period on Minnesota calls. I'd see a Minnesota call. I would track it. I'd watch the prices of it. I would watch prices at auctions. I would watch it in private sales. Many of the sales I've made, sales I would watch and see consummated at shows. So I had a wide berth of ways of tracking this, and I spent 20 years tracking it, so I'm very comfortable with the prices on it.
Yeah.
It's a price guide, but it's more than that, because
that's a history.
Yeah, it's history. But if you take a look at the back half of the duck call book, the volume 2.
Oh, your book, yes, definitely more than that. But
yeah, so it's got literally every Minnesota call maker, 100% full color call. So and then it has a number by it, and then if you take the corresponding number, you go to the table, and that table took me 10 years to build. Over time. It's not 10 years of
It's not an Excel sheet. It's like really nice.
It was a lot of work, and I just picked at it a little bit at a time and a little bit at a time. If I tried to do it, it would have been so overwhelming I would never have done it. But over a 10-year period, I built that table to go along with the calls. So I photographed the calls, I put them into the book, I arranged them, but it'll tell you when that call was made. It'll tell you who made it. It'll tell you where they're from. It'll tell you everything about what style of call that is, what it's made out of, everything that's pertinent. And then it'll tell you the rarity and scarcity of the call, and then it'll tell you a price.
Yeah, and that's amazing, especially for like new collectors.
Yes.
To have that resource.
That's what I wanted. So basically, if you thought you had a Minnesota call, you would be able to go to that book. You would be able to find a picture that corresponded to it. You go, oh, that's that call. Then you would be able to say it's, whatever, it's 206. You would go to the table in 206 and you would know everything you want to know about that call.
So yeah, that's so handy for somebody. I mean, just collectors and then new collectors. Yeah, and for me as well, like as someone who's really just interested in the history side of things.
And what's cool about it?
I learned so much from it.
Sure, and what's cool about it is, you should come to Memphis and see the collection.
Yes, well, you should.
It's nice to come to Memphis. Great town to come to. The pyramid, all that. The Heritage Center is fantastic, right? See the collection. If you can't see the collection, you can't come to it. Literally every call that's in that collection is in that book. Like I said, 100% full.
Though I
full
very
size
much
color.
recommend looking at these things in person. But so anyway, about the book and your research for it, the stories they are secondhand. Some of them are secondhand stories. Some are firsthand stories. What was your method about going to get the stories about the carvers?
So I looked first to see if there was something already published on it, right?
Okay.
So like we talked about Paul England writing profiles of, say, a Ralph True from Hopkins, Minnesota for the Call Collectors Association. I also wanted to have the book not be just all my perspective. I wanted to bring in as many perspectives as I could. So if somebody wrote something of value, and especially if they had interviewed or knew this person and they were passed, and I could not go back and replicate that. All I could do is regurgitate at that point.
Right. That's interesting because not all books. Yours is different in that way.
So I wanted to shine as. So you look at my books too. It really is. It is all things Minnesota.
It's an encyclopedia.
And I have many artists, from Minnesota have contributed artwork to that, and they willingly were happy to be involved with the project, which I found. I can't even tell you how gratifying it is to have someone like a Bob White or Les Cooper or whatever tell me, yeah, pick what you want and reproduce it in the book. So there's artwork, there's articles, great articles that were written, historical pieces from the newspaper. You had to play a detective. I mean, I was at the like I said, I was combing obituaries. I was combing the historical center. I was there for every day for years, digging up information on these people, going through the newspaper archives, finding articles that were written at that time. I mean, I have articles from 1916 written about Nels Hansen. You're not going to get a better story on Nels Hansen than that was written in the Zimmerman Times. So I really did my due diligence, and I really did a lot of digging, and that's why it was 10 years to produce the book. And for me, it wasn't about a deadline or anything like that. It was about trying to get it right.
Okay.
When I was happy with it, that's when I was going to publish it.
Yeah. I mean, that's good since it was like not, you were doing it on your own dime and all that, so you weren't having the outside pressure. And
yeah. The only pressure I put on
was your own?
My own pressure, yes.
So what is a favorite story that you've found over your time? You can give me a couple if you can't choose.
Favorite stories. Well, okay, so from decoy perspective?
Either, it doesn't matter.
Oh, I'll give you so from a decoy perspective, the most significant thing that came out of all this research was finding Ole Gunderson from Ashby, Minnesota. So Ole Gunderson now is the second highest selling decoy at auction from Minnesota, previously unheard of. Literally, I was going to press with the decoy book when I got a call from an artist who was up in the Evansville area, John House, and some of his artists reproducing there, also a decoy maker. And he calls me. I'm literally getting files over to the printer, and we're getting ready to start rolling presses. He calls me up and he says, I got some decoys you need to take a look at. And I go, I've heard this story 1,000 times. I can't tell you how many times I've had to look at some decoys and it turns out to be a bag of Herder's decoys. Not that there's anything wrong with Herder's decoys. Great history. But we know about Herder's decoys.
We know all about them.
Right. I said, well, I tell you what, I said, I'm really going to press. I said, he was pretty adamant. And I said, well, at least can you take a couple of photos and just send them to me, text them to me so I can at least see what they are.
Right.
I took one look at the decoys and I go, oh boy. I've got to run up to Ashby, Minnesota. And I did. And it was hold the presses. I got to go up to Ashby. And I went up to Ashby and they asked me, what should we do with these decoys? They said, they've been in a barn for 50 years. And what should we do with these? And I said, they said they're all covered with soot and dirt and grime. I said, don't do anything more than maybe run a garden hose over them until I get there.
Right, yeah.
So I'm telling you, I drive up that driveway, get up there. I'm up there the next day. And I get up there and I go up the driveway and they're sitting out in the grass. And I knew as soon as I stepped out, I go, these are exceptional decoys. So nobody knew who the maker was. Everyone up in Ashby and everyone around Lake Christina probably knew this, but it wasn't known by the decoy community.
Right.
It's also amazing that with all the pickers that have been up combing that area, because this is Lake Christina, it's like Heron Lake. People. Yeah. It's not unheard of. It's not like it's a secret, right?
Right.
Nobody's found this guy or done the work, and that's one of the unfortunate things I've always found with, especially in the early days of collecting. People were more about picking than getting the information.
Yeah,
and history.
it was more amassing.
And a lot of it was mishmashed or written down poorly, and secondhand, third-hand information. So I saw the decoys, and I knew there were some that really had something. So I talked to him, and I said, "Well, what are you going to do with these decoys? How many decoys do you have? I got a barn full of them. You got a barn full of them. All right." And they said, "These are just this is just 6 of the best examples that we had that I looked at. There's some pintails, which is a very unusual species for Minnesota for a carver to make especially back in the 20s or 10s.
Right,
Or maybe even 1800s. It could be as old as that.
Yeah, that's true.
And so he had that. He also had ringbills, also very unusual. You see a lot of bluebills in Minnesota, but you don't see people that specifically made a ringer. And he had canvasbacks, which of course was the duck on Christina. So that made sense. He also made coots, and he was making those for confidence decoys way back then.
Oh, wow.
So we're talking about the turn of last century, right? Long story short, I talked to him, and he said, "Well, do you think there's any value to these?" I said, "Oh, yeah." I said, "There's value in these decoys." He says, "Well, how much do you think?" And I said, "Thousands." And he says, "For all of them?" And I said, "No."
Individually.
I said, "For one of them." And I said, "The only question is how many thousands?"
Yeah.
And they looked at me like I was crazy. I said, "No, I'm serious." I said, These are exceptional decoys." So I said, you need to take these and, put them somewhere safe, and, we'll look at the other decoys and see what you have. But they did have some the best decoys that they showed me had been saved in the house. Okay. So somebody had one example of each of the species or a couple examples and had them in the in their house. So those ones were much better than the ones that were in the barn. They had been hunted for 50, 60 years, and they had been in a barn for another 50 years. So these decoys, they had the mouse chews on them. They had animals, and they rework on them, repaint, reheaded and stuff like that. But still, amongst them, there were still some pretty darn good examples of them beyond the 6 that I originally viewed. Well, anyways, once they realized that was worth that much money, the next thing I heard is they had brought them and put them in the vault at the bank at Ashby, the little 6 decoys. Because I convinced them. I said, if you're looking to sell them, if you want to sell them, I said, the only way we're going to really know, because there's no precedence on these decoys. Nobody even knows who this guy is. Right. So I'm getting as much information as I can from them on this maker, who turns out to be Ole Gunderson, who goes by a myriad of other names. Ole, because he was an old Scandinavian. When somebody said, "Who are you?" Ole. So they called him Ole. So he had other names too. But Ole Gunderson is the one we tend to call him by. So I convinced him that what we need to do is put them in auction, and we need to put them in a good auction. I said, I'm talking a national audience, national auction. So I suggest to him, Guyot and Schmidt at the National Decoy Show would be a natural place for that.
Right.
So that's what we did. And we took those 6 decoys and we brought them to the auction, where they were pretty much seen for the first time, with very little information. Because I was getting ready to publish that book. I got as much of a biography as I could put together from him, but it was very, very difficult to put together. So it was scant. Is what I would say, but it was the broad strokes.
Or at least it identified them,
right? And we knew who made them. We knew we can confirm that and all that sort of thing. Well, they went to auction, and it's like I said, they turned out to be the John Tax from Osakis, Minnesota, is a #1 decoy, at auction in Minnesota. Ole Gunderson, after that auction, came in at #2. I'm going by rough numbers here, but the high head pintails that he made that were sold, there was a pair of them sold at the auction. They went for like $39,000. So that was pretty good. And then the canvasbacks.
And what year was that?
Was that auction? Yeah. God, that's a good. Well, it was right about the time I published the book, so it had been 2010. Maybe 2010.
That's really good for 2010.
Oh yeah, and again, I'm a firm believer. All those decoys that were sold at that auction in that year, so some, and the people that bought them were very experienced decoy collectors,
right,
and that really gave them the stamp of approval. Right.
Right.
I'm very much convinced that those were a bargain, and you'll never buy that. You'll not buy those pintails for $39,000.
No, not
the
if that was 2010. Yeah,
exactly. So that really set a precedent and put, like I said, put the stamp of approval on those decoys.
So did all of them get sold at that point? Are they all now in private hands?
After that, so those 6 decoys got sold. I helped the family sell what I call the second tier level of decoys, and then I probably there was a third level tier of them. And those are, I believe, for the most part, except for a handful of them that I still know that are in family members' hands that aren't selling them. I would say the best of the Gunderson decoys are out and in collections right now. There was a lot of them left that I don't know what happened to them. So that's another mystery.
Yeah, interesting.
But I don't hound people. They know who I am, and so if anybody wanted to contact me, that's great. But like I said, I don't pester people when it's like that.
That's interesting.
But as a result, like I said, I had very little time to do the biography and the information and the research. I didn't have the time to do the research that was necessary to do that. So the second book, now volume 2, now it is fleshed out into, I probably have 30 pages or so on him, and it's dead on information. I mean, I've had a chance to.
Is he the most extensive you did in the second book?
Oh, definitely, because he's John Tax. We had him nailed in the first book. Everything was good there, but Ole needed more. Ole needed more work, and I mean considerably more work. So that's kind of what happened with the second book, and why there is a second book, because there was a need to get that information out there. Interestingly. The Ole Gunderson decoy, once I saw him, I started doing some thinking and started digging back through some of my old auction catalogs.
Right. Hey, did you find?
I found a decoy that was represented as Upper New York State.
Wow, that's a big jump.
And that sold to 2 very, very knowledgeable collectors, and there was 2 of them, and they bought them and split the decoys up. And they were canvasbacks. They were their early canvasbacks that Ole Gunderson did. And they sold for a pretty good sum. I'm trying to remember $17,000 maybe for the pair, which is a good price. But they were represented as Upper New York State. I remember that. And I went back and I found. I go, Ole Gunderson.
Yeah.
So Ole had sold, and he already had done fairly well for himself as an unknown carver. And then more stories started coming up, and people started contacting me, go, I've got one of those decoys. I never knew what it was, but I always liked it, and it's on my shelf.
So just for our non-decoy people, describe what is it about an Ole Gunderson, like when you see it, that you would have like recognized it as superior
it comes down to a number of things, but it really comes down to form. Form is at the top, and it was one of those things. Even the photos that I saw, I go, "Oh, those really have nice form." That's the number one driving thing. Then you start looking at things like the paint. And then I also know the history. I knew they were old, and I knew they were from Lake Christina, and they were used on Lake Christina. So they have history, and they have provenance, and we can put a name on them. So we have all these things going for us. They had the great patina. They were very nice, mellowed. Everything was great about them, but the form first and foremost. And they were a very different shape than most decoys that people are familiar with. And Ole did some really interesting things. Again, here we go back to the better mousetrap and the having more time than money, and I can do it as well as a store bought. One of the cool things on his very earliest decoys, he had some trademark things that become Ole Gunderson, and one of them was his eyes. He used window pane glass, and he filed them round, and he painted the eye color on the reverse side and set them into the decoy. Nobody, to my knowledge, does anything like that. That's Ole Gunderson. He also utilized old printer slugs and used those for ballast weights. And he obviously had a sense of humor, because he was picking out all these slugs. He could have used anything he wanted to from there, but a lot of times they were like laxatives and things like that. So I go, sense of humor. Tells me the man had a sense of humor. But the more I learned about him, and from firsthand interviews of people that knew him, lived with him, he was a character.
Right. Yeah.
He was a great character, but he lived duck hunting and decoy making. So that's an example, and that's some of the things that are why we needed to do the second book and to finish that off.
Right. That kind of leads to my last big question. Why do you think it is so important to have such a comprehensive look at it? Whereas, there's other books that kind of give you the main, but why is it so important to have that huge backlog of information?
Because I really believe it might be the only comprehensive look at it. So this is it. This is our Minnesota Bible. That's what I wanted. That's what I wanted to build. And like you said, I didn't have any restraints. As my dad would say, chief cook and bottle washer, right? I do everything with this book, and it's my vision, and I can do it the way I want to. And I've spent a lifetime, like I said, in the industry where you're doing everything by committee, and sometimes committees just kills a project. This is my vision, and I've live or die by it, and it's been very well received, obviously, and I'm very, very grateful for that and very humbled by that. But I wanted this to be, if this is the only thing that's ever going to be done documenting Minnesota call makers and decoy makers, I want it to be comprehensive. But and call making is really interesting because it's really gone through a renaissance in the last several years.
100%.
Right. So I always, somebody asked me what's the biggest difference of call makers today versus the early call makers, and frankly, technically they sound better. Yeah. I truly believe, and not to say that some of the old call makers didn't make great sounding calls, because they did.
They did.
But technically we're much more advanced with
the reeds and all
machinery and how and materials that we use and knowledge that's been gleaned over the years. But you take a look at, if you go to the fancy call contest at the National Wild Turkey Federation, or at one of at the show in Chicago or whatever, and you see what's being done fancy calls, it's light years apart from what we would consider a fancy call from back in the the 30s or 40s. An example would be like a Purdue call, which was considered a fancy call. It's cool, and I love them, but they're folky more than than it's a great representation of a duck, right? But you take a look at what someone's doing now, some of the call makers, it's sculpture.
Oh, yeah. And they're not, unlike decoy makers, call makers are not, they're not restricted by, it's not thought poorly by using newer technology to create them. You can still use a lathe and things like that. Whereas with ducks and decoys, it's a little bit, you have the purists and the more modern makers.
No, I know exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, with duck calls, you don't have that restriction.
Call makers is up to your imagination and your abilities, and there's such a diversity in it, and it's acceptable.
Right.
But a decoy is still a working object too, from the standpoint. And there's only so much you can do with a decoy. It has to look like a duck. It should look like the species it's representing, and it's got to float and it's got to work. So there's a lot of constrictions on that. But like I said, you take a call. I look at some of the fancy calls that are made now, and I go, "Where's the call in here? I got to figure out where's the call, because it still has to.
It still has to work. Yeah,
they still work. Yeah. But I go, wow, it's like I would see it as a sculpture more than I would see it as a as a call.
Some of them you have to take like a piece off. They got
yeah, yep. And like I said, and the bar is raised every year. You don't see that with the decoys.
No, because there's two camps. There's the purist decoy carver, and then there's the more modern.
Correct.
Yeah. So you kind of and they don't necessarily all think well of each other. So
it's working versus maybe decorative.
Well, and a little bit of, and then even in working, there's a little bit of divide.
Yes.
So it's much more, I don't know, nuanced than the call makers. What's nice about that is where decoy makers, which I would wish there would be more decoy makers, they're having a problem with growth, whereas call makers have exploded.
Yes, absolutely. Like I said, total renaissance in it, and it's impressive. It really is.
Yeah, and it's keeping that art going, which is great, and I like that. And that's another thing with collecting calls that we've talked on here before. Ryan Graves has been on. You talked about Minnesota calls being more accessible at the time when you were collecting. Calls in general are a little more accessible. They're getting to be more pricey as they've gotten more popular.
Absolutely.
But they still are more accessible to, especially with all the modern call makers, to the newer collector.
Absolutely.
So it's more open for new collectors.
Well, and I see a lot of guys that get, whitewash the contemporary makers. I don't want to collect them. And I go, you got to remember, guys,
they won't be contemporary forever.
They're not going to always be contemporary. And then you're going to go, I should have bought one of his calls back when I could have bought it. Now I can't.
Well,
afford
I don't have a call maker to give an example, but let's look at Schmiedlin's.
Right, that's a great example.
They're blowing up. They're going for crazy numbers right now.
Absolutely.
And people
it's
10 years ago.
You're not appreciated until you're dead, right?
100%.
Yeah.
So one thing I always like to ask collectors because we have a lot of audience that is younger or might be interested in getting into collecting. Do you have any advice for someone that is wanting to get into this?
Yeah, educate yourself. That's the number one thing. So I have the opportunity. I have lots of young collectors and people coming into it. I shouldn't even say young collectors, but new collectors coming into the hobby. And the first thing I say is educate yourself. And that's what the books are for. There's a million good books on decoys and call. There's getting to be a really nice library of call books out there.
There is.
So you should be able to. You need to educate yourself first before you just go hog wild and start buying like I did. Go get yourself educated, and then the hardest thing to do is then try to make a plan. So something that makes sense, and try to focus yourself. And that's very, very hard to do when you first start, because everything's interesting to you at that point.
Yeah, it's all new and exciting.
It is, and then but if you could do it, if you could make yourself do it, it would pay you huge dividends, and you would be happier down the road. So, like I said, find an area, a niche that interests you, and focus on that. And educate yourself as much as you can.
All right. So is there anything you would like to say to our listeners before we sign off? Anything you want to add?
I'm excited about having these calls. So this, again, like I said, I was with the Minnesota Foundation, the Decoy Association, the books. All of this was part of the mission to preserve the history of Minnesota call makers and decoy makers, and the history of waterfowling in Minnesota. And to have the opportunity, and I think I've done a lot to help promote and educate people on what's Minnesota, and have made it more collectible to a broader spectrum of people. But I think this, to me, having the opportunity to put these calls where literally millions of people will have an opportunity to see those calls will help elevate the Minnesota call makers in stature, and that's
and
that's
you're
exciting.
in a tough area.
Yeah, I know.
You're surrounded by Arkansas and Tennessee,
Illinois, everybody.
Yeah, they're all right here.
Louisiana, I am. But so we're bringing in something that might be unfamiliar to a lot of people.
100%.
But I will tell you this. It will be one of the more diverse collections you're going to see because like I said, Minnesota guys, it was always about building a better mousetrap, and where you look at Louisiana has a school, Illinois kind of has a school. You start looking at carvers, they have schools. Minnesota's just all over the board. Everybody thought they could do a better job than the next guy, and they all had a vision. And so I think you're going to see a very diverse and very I think it'll be very interesting to a wider range of people is what I believe. And that's my hope.
Well, I'm excited. I know it'll be great. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was fun.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I love it.
Also, thanks to our producer, Chris Isaac, for putting the show together. And then finally, thanks to you, our listener, for supporting wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks. Stay tuned to the Ducks.